When people think of Matthew Garber, the chubby-cheeked Michael Banks, from Mary Poppins, they see a golden childhood wrapped in Disney magic. His mischievous grin and bright eyes were the very definition of joy, a human spoonful of sugar that could wash away any bitterness. The world was convinced that a kid this beloved was destined for a future paved with roses, worthy of the light he brought to the screen. It was supposed to be a fairy tale that never ended. But instead of glory, Matthew was met with a death that was literally rotting him from the inside out. His body began to digest its own organs. Forget the cruel rumors about drugs. The 21-year-old was killed by something far more mundane, yet equally deadly. According to his brother Fergus, it all began with bad meat eaten in India, a simple meal that triggered a fatal case of necrotic pancreatitis. He wasted away in excruciating pain that doctors were helpless to stop, a demise so raw and senseless it feels impossible for a Disney angel. So, what exactly happened to him during those lost years off-screen? Matthew wasn't born into the swimming pools of Beverly Hills or the manicured lawns of the home counties. He was born in Stepney, in the East End of London, on March 25th, 1956. Strip away the glass towers and modern wealth of today, and you are left with the raw reality of 1950s Stepney. In 1956, London was a city still nursing a hangover from the Second World War. The Blitz had ended over a decade prior, but the scars were still visible. There were still bomb sites, gaping holes in the streetscapes where houses used to be, that had been turned into makeshift playgrounds by local children. The air was thick with coal smoke. The buildings were stained with soot. It was a working-class, gritty, and deeply communal world, but inside the Garber household, the atmosphere was different. It was electric with creativity. Matthew's parents, Louis and Marguerite Garber, were not your average East Enders. They were performers. Both were classically trained stage actors who understood the power of storytelling. They knew the difference between the gray reality of post-war Britain and the technicolor magic of the theater. Matthew grew up in a home where pretending wasn't just a child's game. It was a respected profession. It was a craft. However, and this is a crucial distinction, Matthew was not a stage kid in the traditional sense. We often imagine child stars as products of pushy parents, mothers who drag their toddlers to tap dancing lessons before they can walk, fathers who see their children as meal tickets. This was not the case for the Garbers. Louis and Marguerite knew the industry, and perhaps because they knew it so well, they didn't force it upon their son. Matthew was simply a bright, energetic London lad. He attended St. Paul's Primary School in Winchmore Hill. He scraped his knees, he played in the streets, and he developed a reputation not for reciting Shakespeare, but for mischief. It was a time of exploration. And unbeknownst to his parents, Matthew was absorbing this energy. He was a boy with a racer's spirit. He didn't walk, he ran. He didn't smile, he grinned. He was a bundle of kinetic energy waiting for a direction. So, how does a regular boy from Stepney who had no agent and no headshots end up catching the eye of the most powerful man in animation, Walt Disney? It wasn't through a massive open casting call. It wasn't through a talent show. It was, as the best stories often are, a stroke of pure serendipity. The connection came through Matthew's father, Louis. In the tight-knit world of British theater, everyone knew everyone. Louis Garber was friends with the great Shakespearean actor Roy Dotrice. Roy Dotrice is a name that might ring a bell for fans of Game of Thrones. He played Helaine the Pyromancer, but in the 1960s he was a titan of the stage. More importantly for our story, Roy was the father of a little girl named Karen Dotrice. Karen was already on Disney's radar. She was a polished, incredibly talented young actress who had been cast in a film called The 3 Lives of Thomasina. Disney was looking for a boy to play alongside her. They needed someone small, someone British, and someone with a spark. Roy Dotrice made a suggestion. He told the casting directors, "You should look at Louis Garber's lad. He's a funny little thing." This was the moment the door opened. But when the casting directors looked at Matthew Garber, they didn't see a polished, rehearsed robot. They didn't see a child who had memorized lines or knew how to hit a mark. They saw a whirlwind. They saw a boy who played artful dodges, scrunching his nose up, squinting his eyes against the sun, brushing his hair back with one hand while plotting his next prank with the other. He wasn't acting. He was just being a cheeky 7-year-old. And this is exactly what Walt Disney was looking for. Walt Disney had a philosophy about child actors. He often disliked the Hollywood kids, the ones who were too perfect, too plastic, too aware of the camera. He wanted real children. He wanted children who looked like they had just climbed a tree or scraped a knee. He wanted the untamed, chaotic energy of actual childhood. Matthew Garber was undeniably real. His career began in 1963 with The 3 Lives of Thomasina. It was a charming film about a cat with magical powers, and it served as a testing ground. It was here that Matthew was first paired with Karen Dotrice. The chemistry was instantaneous. Karen was the serious, soulful, slightly melancholic girl. Matthew was the spark plug, the comic relief, the burst of energy. They were the perfect yin and yang. Disney saw this footage and knew he had found his gold. He was preparing for the biggest live-action gamble of his career. He was preparing for Mary Poppins. It is hard to overstate just how massive the production of Mary Poppins was in 1964. It wasn't just a movie, it was the crowning jewel of Walt Disney's career. He had spent 20 years trying to acquire the rights from the author, P.L. Travers. The budget was enormous. The sets were technological marvels, and right there in the center of it, holding his own against titans of entertainment like Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke, was little Matthew. The studio insiders quickly gave him a nickname, the youngest method actor in movies. Now, usually method acting implies a deep psychological immersion into a role, like Marlon Brando or Daniel Day-Lewis. For Matthew, it meant something different. It meant that he couldn't be told to act. He had to feel it. If the director, Robert Stevenson, wanted Matthew to look sad, he couldn't just say, "Okay, Matthew, look sad." Matthew would just stare at him. He didn't know how to fake sadness. To get the reaction, the director would have to actually shout at him or take a toy away. Then Matthew would get genuinely upset and the cameras would roll. If they wanted him to look surprised, they had to actually surprise him. It was raw. It was genuine. It was unpolished. And that is why, when you watch the film today, Michael Banks feels so relatable. When he rolls his eyes at his nanny, that is Matthew Garber rolling his eyes at the absurdity of adults. When he laughs, it is a real belly laugh. But there is one story from the set of Mary Poppins that truly captures the spirit of Matthew Garber and the hidden vulnerability behind his bravado. We all remember the "I love to laugh" scene. Uncle Albert, played by Ed Wynn, is floating on the ceiling, overcome with laughter. Mary, Bert, and the children join him for a tea party in the air. To film this, the actors had to be hoisted up on thin wires, suspended 20 feet above the hard, concrete studio floor. For a professional like Dick Van Dyke, this was just part of the job, but Matthew was 7 years old. Decades later, Dick Van Dyke revealed a touching secret about that scene. Little Matthew was terrified of heights. The idea of being hoisted up on a wire paralyzed him. He wasn't being stubborn when he hesitated. He was experiencing genuine, primal childhood fear. The crew had to negotiate with him. They couldn't force him. So they turned to the one language every 7-year-old understands, bribery. Cast members later recalled that for every take where Matthew had to be pulled up into the air, the director paid him a bonus, a shiny penny. Sometimes, if the scene was particularly high or long, legend has it that they negotiated up to a dime. Watch that scene again. Look at Michael Banks's face as he floats near the ceiling. When you see him looking slightly grumpy, wide-eyed, or clutching the table, you aren't seeing acting. You are seeing a little boy from Stepney who is not happy about being suspended in the air, wondering if the wire will hold, but doing it anyway because he wants that dime. It humanizes him, doesn't it? It reminds us that behind the iconic character was just a little boy trying to be brave. Karen Dotrice, his on-screen sister, later spoke about him with a heavy heart. She described him as having an unusual lack of inhibition. While other children were self-conscious, worrying about how they looked or what the adults thought, Matthew was just present. He was completely free. He was a born daredevil, she said. He loved being naughty, finding a little building to jump off of. He was the spirit of mischief. He was the boy who wouldn't take his medicine in the movie, the boy who wanted to fly his kite. His career was a shooting star. After Mary Poppins swept the Oscars and became a global phenomenon, Matthew returned for one final Disney film, The Gnome Mobile, in 1967, once again pairing with Karen Dotrice. He was 11 years old. He was famous. He had money in the bank. He had the world at his feet. Most child stars at this point would be fighting for the next contract. Their parents would be pushing for TV shows, for record deals, for merchandise. Matthew did the opposite. He simply walked away. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He wanted to be a boy. The suit and tie of Michael Banks were hung up in the wardrobe, and Matthew Garber put on his school uniform. He returned to London and enrolled at Highgate School. Now, Highgate is not just any school. Situated in North London, it is an institution with a history stretching back to Queen Elizabeth I. It is a place of ivy-covered walls, strict uniforms, and high academic expectations. It is the kind of place that breeds politicians, poets, and scientists. It is easy to imagine that a boy who had just spent 3 years in the California sun, hanging out with Walt Disney and Dick Van Dyke, might struggle to fit back into the rigid hierarchy of a British all-boys school. One might expect him to be arrogant, to strut through the quadrangle telling stories about Hollywood parties, demanding special treatment. But the accounts from his classmates paint a picture that is both refreshing and somewhat surprising. Matthew Garber didn't care about fame. In fact, he seemed almost allergic to it. Friends from that era recall that Matthew rarely, if ever, mentioned Mary Poppins. If someone brought it up, perhaps mocking him for the tweed coat or the tuppence song, he would shrug it off with a grin. To him, acting hadn't been a career. It had been a lark. It was just something fun he did when he was little, like being a Cub Scout or learning to ride a bike. It didn't define him. Instead, at Highgate, Matthew defined himself through action. He channeled that racer's spirit that Karen Dotrice had noticed on set. He wasn't the best scholar in the room, bearing his nose in Latin textbooks. He was the boy at the back of the class, leaning back in his chair, waiting for the bell to ring so he could run. He became known as a sportsman. He loved the physical rough and tumble of rugby. He loved the individualism of swimming. But more than anything, he developed a reputation as a gentle rebel. He wasn't malicious. He didn't break rules to hurt anyone. He broke rules because he found them boring. He was the kind of boy who would climb the school roof just to see the view, or organize a prank that left the teachers scratching their heads while the students stifled laughter. He was, in essence, living out the childhood that Michael Banks had only dreamed of. Michael Banks had to be taught by Mary Poppins how to have fun. Matthew Garber knew it instinctively. As he moved from the 1960s into the early 1970s, Matthew grew from a cute, round-faced boy into a handsome, striking young man. The baby fat melted away. He grew tall and lean. His hair grew longer, matching the fashion of the times. And it is here, in these teenage years, that we see the divergence that would lead to his tragedy. Most of his peers at Highgate were on a conveyor belt. Finish school, go to university, Oxford, or Cambridge if they were lucky, get a degree, get a job in the city, get married, settle down. It was the safe, prescribed British path. Matthew looked at that path and saw a cage. He didn't want a desk, he didn't want a mortgage, he wanted experience. He was part of a generation that was beginning to question the materialism of the West. He was reading Kerouac, he was listening to rock and roll, he was absorbing the philosophical waves crashing over from the counterculture movement. By 1976, Matthew was 20 years old. He was at a crossroads. He could have returned to acting, his name still carried weight, and he could have easily walked into a casting agency and revived his career. He could have gone to university. Instead, he bought a backpack. Matthew joined the famous hippie trail, an overland pilgrimage stretching from Europe to South Asia. Unlike the modern gap year traveler booking flights on a smartphone, this was a rugged journey seeking enlightenment, simpler living, and raw experience. Thousands of young Westerners packed their lives into rucksacks and headed east, and Matthew was drawn to this magnetic pull. The hippie trail was an overland route that stretched from Europe to South Asia. It usually started in London or Amsterdam, wound through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and ended in Nepal. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. Thousands of young Westerners, American, British, French, German, packed their lives into rucksacks and headed east. They were looking for something they felt was missing in their own cultures. They were looking for enlightenment, for simpler ways of living, for cheap food, and yes, often for the abundant and legal or semi-legal hashish that could be found in places like Kabul and Kathmandu. Matthew Garber was drawn to this magnetic pull. He wasn't going there to become a drug lord, as the later rumors would maliciously suggest. He was going there as a tourist of the soul. He longed to witness the Golden Temple, breathe in the spices of Delhi, and stand in the awe-inspiring shadow of the Himalayas. It is important to emphasize this. Matthew was not a runaway junkie. He was a curious, bright 20-year-old man doing exactly what thousands of other bright 20-year-olds were doing. He was exploring. He left London in 1976 with high hopes. We can imagine him saying goodbye to his parents, Louis and Marguerite. They likely worried. Parents always worry. But they also understood him. They were artists, after all. They understood the need to see the world to understand it. They probably told him to be careful, to write letters, to come home safe. They could not have known that when he walked out the door, he was walking toward a biological time bomb. For months, Matthew traveled. He experienced the sensory overload of India, the vibrant colors, the crushing crowds, the ancient temples. He was living on a shoestring budget, staying in cheap guest houses, eating street food, and meeting travelers from all over the globe. By all accounts, he was happy. He was free. But India, for all its beauty, can be unforgiving to the uninitiated immune system. The drug overdose rumor that haunted Matthew's legacy for 40 years relies on the idea that he sought out his own destruction. It suggests he was injecting heroin or smoking himself into oblivion in some dark opium den. The truth, revealed by his brother Fergus, is so much more mundane, and therefore so much more terrifying. Matthew didn't seek out death, he just ate dinner. It likely happened in a roadside dhaba or a cheap hostel cafeteria. Matthew was hungry. He ordered a meal, perhaps a curry, perhaps some meat skewers. He ate it, paid his few rupees, and moved on. He didn't know that the meat was tainted. He didn't know that microscopic viral agents were currently invading his bloodstream. He had contracted hepatitis. Now, in the 21st century, we have vaccines for hepatitis A and B. We have robust travel medicine clinics. We know to drink bottled water and be wary of street meat. But in 1976 on the hippie trail, hygiene was often an afterthought. Hepatitis was known colloquially among travelers as the Bombay belly or the yellow sickness. It was common. Many travelers got a mild form of it, spent a week sweating it out in a hotel room, and recovered. And this is where Matthew's fatal error occurred. It wasn't an error of morality. It was an error of judgment born of youth. When he started feeling ill, the fatigue, the nausea, the stomach cramps, he didn't panic. He was 20 years old. He was fit. He was a rugby player. He thought he was invincible. He likely told himself, "It's just a bug. I'll sleep it off. I'll be fine in a few days." He didn't want to cut his trip short. He didn't want to call his dad and ask for a flight home. He wanted to tough it out. So he waited. But this wasn't a mild stomach bug. The virus was aggressive. While Matthew lay in a sweltering room, perhaps in Delhi or Bombay, thinking he was just fighting off a fever, his internal organs were under siege. The hepatitis was triggering a chain reaction. It wasn't just attacking his liver, it was spreading to his pancreas. The pancreas is a small leaf-shaped organ that sits behind the stomach. It releases enzymes to help digestion. But when it gets infected or inflamed, a condition called pancreatitis, those enzymes can get trapped. Instead of digesting food, they begin to digest the pancreas itself. Essentially, the enzymes turned into a poison, attacking the very tissues they were meant to serve. By the time Matthew realized that this wasn't something he could sleep off, the damage was catastrophic. He wasn't just sick, he was dying. The pain of pancreatitis is described by doctors as one of the most excruciating pains a human can endure. It is a blinding, searing pain in the abdomen that radiates to the back. Eventually, the message got through to London. We don't know if it was a telegram or a crackling phone call, but Louis Garber received the news that every parent dreads. His son was in India. He was critically ill. He couldn't move. Louis Garber didn't hesitate. He boarded a plane and flew to India to retrieve his boy. One can only imagine the scene when Louis finally reached Matthew. He had last seen his son as a vibrant, healthy, handsome adventurer. The young man he found in that Indian hospital bed would have been unrecognizable. Matthew had lost a terrifying amount of weight. His skin and eyes would have been deeply jaundiced, yellowed by the failing liver. He would have been in agony, likely delirious with fever and pain. The guilt Louis must have felt, and the fear, is palpable. But there was no time for despair. The mission was simple. Get him home. Get him to British doctors. Get him to safety. They managed to get Matthew on a flight back to London. It must have been a nightmare journey. Hours upon hours in a cramped cabin, Matthew likely sedated or groaning in pain, his father holding his hand, watching the clouds pass by, praying that they were moving fast enough. They landed in London in early 1977. An ambulance rushed them to the Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead. This was a world-class facility. If anyone could save him, it was the doctors here. The medical team swarmed him. They ran tests. They stabilized him. But when the results came back, the room must have gone quiet. The diagnosis was hemorrhagic necrotizing pancreatitis. To put it in layman's terms, huge sections of his pancreas had died, necrosis, and were bleeding, hemorrhagic. The infection was rampant. His body was in a state of total shock. In 1977, medical technology was advanced, but it wasn't magic. Pancreatitis of this severity has a frighteningly high mortality rate, even today. Back then, it was essentially a death sentence. But Matthew was young, he had a strong heart, and so the battle began. For months, Matthew Garber lay in the Royal Free Hospital. This is the part of the story that the drug overdose rumors completely gloss over. An overdose is usually quick. It is a sudden stop. What Matthew endured was a long, slow, grueling war of attrition. He didn't die immediately upon returning. He fought. Fergus, his younger brother, remembers visiting him. He remembers the contrast. This was the brother who used to wrestle him, the brother who played pranks, the brother who had been the naughty Michael Banks. Now he was tethered to machines, his body frail, his spirit dimmed by morphine and exhaustion. It is a cruel irony that haunts this narrative. In Mary Poppins, the central conflict for Michael Banks often revolved around medicine. He refused the spoonful of sugar. He didn't want to take what was good for him. Now here was the real Matthew, being pumped full of every medicine available, and none of it was enough. The doctors tried everything. They managed his pain. They tried to control the infection. There were moments of hope, perhaps days where he seemed a little brighter, where the fever broke, but the necrosis was relentless. As spring turned to summer in London, the hope began to fade. The damage to his internal organs was too extensive. His body, which had once climbed trees and jumped off buildings on the Disney backlot, simply had nothing left to give. On June 13th, 1977, the fight ended. Matthew Garber took his final breath. He was 21 years old. On a gray day in June 1977, a small procession gathered at St. Marylebone Crematorium in East Finchley, London. The atmosphere was somber, stripping away any last remnants of Hollywood glamour. There were no paparazzi hiding in the bushes. There were no weeping fans lining the streets. There was just a family, broken, confused, and exhausted, saying goodbye to a son and a brother who had barely begun to live. Matthew Garber was cremated. His physical form, the vessel that had once danced across the rooftops of London with a chimney sweep, was returned to ash. It is a haunting image to juxtapose against his most famous work. In Mary Poppins, the chimneys of London are portals to a magical world. They are places where Chim Chim Cher E rings out, where soot is a badge of honor, and where smoke rises up to greet the stars. But at St. Marylebone, the smoke was final. It marked the end of the adventure. The Garber family retreated into their private grief. Louis and Marguerite had lost their firstborn. Fergus had lost his big brother. They did what most British families of that era did. They closed the curtains. They mourned in silence, and they tried to carry on. They didn't hold press conferences to explain the cause of death. They didn't issue press releases to Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. To them, Matthew wasn't a public commodity. He was their boy, and his death was a private tragedy, not a public consumption event. But silence in Hollywood is dangerous. With no official explanation for the death of a 21-year-old returning from India, the tabloids filled the void with the most convenient narrative of the 1970s, drugs. For nearly 30 years, this lie became the accepted epitaph of Michael Banks. He was lumped into the Disney curse, equated with tragic figures like Bobby Driscoll. The world robbed him of his individuality, turning a brave battle against a virus into a shameful secret. His brother Fergus had to live with this defamation for decades, until a moment of vindication finally arrived in 2004. The turning point came with the 40th anniversary of Mary Poppins. The film had transitioned from a hit movie to a cultural artifact, a masterpiece that defined the 20th century. Disney was preparing a massive celebration. They were releasing a special edition DVD. They were producing documentaries, and they were looking back at their history. As part of this, the Walt Disney Company decided to induct a new class of Disney legends. The Disney Legends Award is the highest honor the company can bestow. It is their Hall of Fame. It is reserved for the animators, the songwriters, like the Sherman Brothers, and the actors who built the House of Mouse. Julie Andrews was already a legend. Dick Van Dyke was a legend, but the children? They had been overlooked. In 2004, Disney made the call. They decided to honor Matthew Garber and Karen Dotrice. For Karen, it was a moment of celebration. For the Garber family, it was something far more profound. It was vindication. Fergus Garber was invited to Burbank, California, to accept the award on his brother's behalf. Picture the scene. The Disney lot in Burbank is a hallowed place. It is where the film was shot. The sound stages where Matthew had flown on wires were just a few hundred yards away. The animation building where the penguins were drawn stood nearby. Fergus stood on the stage. The room was filled with executives, historians, and fans, but most importantly, the press was there. When Fergus accepted the bronze statue, a sculpture of Mickey Mouse's hand holding a magic wand, he didn't just say thank you. He used the platform to rewrite history. In interviews surrounding the event, Fergus finally broke the silence on a global scale. He looked the reporters in the eye and said the words that needed to be said for 27 years. Matthew did not die of drugs. He explained the trip to India. He explained the hepatitis. He explained the pancreatitis. He dismantled the rock and roll death myth with the cold, hard facts of medical reality. He was a free spirit, Fergus told the press. He wanted to see the world. He caught a disease. It was a tragedy, not a scandal. The relief in the room, and subsequently in the fan community, was palpable. You could almost hear the collective sigh of millions of fans. He wasn't a lost boy after all. He was just an unlucky adventurer. The Disney Legend title did more than just give him a plaque. It sanctified his memory. It put the official Disney stamp of approval on his life. It told the world, this boy is one of us. He is a hero of our history. Treat him with respect. On the official Disney Legends website, his bio was updated. The rumors were scrubbed. The truth about the hepatitis was printed in black and white. Matthew Garber had finally come home. While Fergus provided the facts, it was Karen Dotrice, his on-screen sister Jane, who provided the heart. The reunion in 2004 was bittersweet for Karen. She stood on that stage accepting her award, but the space next to her was empty. The little boy, who had been her partner in crime, her tormentor and her protector on set, was gone. In the years following the ceremony, Karen opened up about Matthew in a way she never had before. Her recollections give us the most vivid picture of who he really was behind the scenes. She didn't paint him as a saint. She painted him as a boy. He was a 1960s kid, she laughed in an interview. He was just full of beans. She recounted stories of how he would hide from the tutors on set. While Karen was dutifully doing her schoolwork, Matthew would be halfway up a lighting rig or trying to feed the animatronic birds. But then her tone would shift. The grief of the survivor would creep in. I regret I didn't keep in touch, she admitted. It is a sentence that carries the weight of 1,000 unmade phone calls. They had been so close for those few years of filming. They had traveled the world together promoting the movies. They had shared an experience, child stardom, that no one else in the world could understand. They were a club of two. But after the No Mobile in 1967, they drifted. Matthew went to Highgate. Karen continued acting. They were teenagers living in different parts of London, exploring different social circles. They assumed, as all young people do, that there would be time. They assumed that one day when they were 30 or 40, they would meet up for a drink and laugh about the time Dick Van Dyke fell off a chimney. Karen's regret is the regret of us all. It is the realization that relationships are fragile and that time is a thief. He was how he looked, she said, describing his on-screen persona. He was an imp. He was a spirit. She also confirmed the nature of his death, backing up Fergus. She expressed her anger at the rumors. To her, Matthew wasn't the tragic junkie. He was the boy who taught her how to be brave. She was the cautious one. He was the one who jumped. In many ways, she carried his spirit with her long after he was gone. As we move towards the conclusion of this story, we have to ask ourselves, why does Michael Banks still matter? Why do we care so much about a boy who acted in 3 movies 50 years ago? The answer lies in the character he created and how that character fused with the actor. Michael Banks is not just a sidekick in Mary Poppins. He is the catalyst. Think about the plot of the film. Jane is compliant. Jane tries to be a lady. But Michael is the rebellion. It is Michael who demands that the money go to feeding the birds, not the bank. It is Michael who creates the chaos at the bank that leads to his father being fired. It is Michael who drives the kite flying at the end. Matthew Garber played Michael not as a brat, but as a truth-teller. He represented the innocence that the adult world tries to crush. Mr. Banks wants order. Michael wants to feed the birds. Mr. Banks wants investments. Michael wants a kite. In a cruel twist of destiny, Matthew Garber lived his real life exactly as Michael Banks would have wanted. He rejected the bank. He rejected the safe corporate path. He didn't want to invest his youth in a desk job. He wanted to go to India. He wanted to see the birds. He wanted to fly the kite. He followed the philosophy of the film to its ultimate conclusion. He chose experience over security, and he paid the ultimate price for it. But in doing so, he preserved his own innocence. He never grew up to become a cynical, washed-up actor selling autographs at conventions for rent money. He never became the bitter old man complaining about the industry. He remains forever young. When we watch the film, we aren't watching a ghost. We are watching a vibrant, living energy that was captured on celluloid. As long as that film runs, Matthew is alive. As long as Let's Go Fly a Kite is sung, Matthew is flying. However, the tragedy remains. We were robbed of the second act. We were robbed of seeing what that racer's spirit could have achieved if the medicine had worked. Would he have become a great photographer, a travel writer, a father? We will never know. All we have is the boy in the flat cap, looking up at the nanny floating down from the clouds, ready for an adventure. Yet memory is a ghostly thing. It exists in the mind, in the archives of film history, and in the hearts of fans. But it also exists in the empty spaces left behind. While Matthew's spirit remained vibrant in the 1964 classic, the relentless march of time eventually demanded a revisit to Cherry Tree Lane. And it was in this return, decades later, that the void left by Matthew Garber shifted from a historical footnote into a painful, visible reality. In 2018, 54 years after the original masterpiece, Disney released Mary Poppins Returns. It was a massive, glitzy production designed to trigger the nostalgia centers of the brain for millions of people. The film was set 20 years after the original. It focused on the grown-up Banks children, Jane and Michael. Emily Mortimer played Jane, and the brilliant Ben Whishaw played Michael. The casting was impeccable, but for those who knew the history, the film was haunted by a palpable absence. Disney brought back everyone they could. Dick Van Dyke, at 93 years old, danced on a desk, defying the laws of aging. Karen Dotrice, the original Jane, made a tear-jerking cameo as a woman asking for directions on Cherry Tree Lane. Even the Penguins made a return. But there was no cameo for the original Michael. There was no nod to Matthew Garber, Other than the character's name, it was a stark visual representation of the tragedy. While Karen Dotrice could walk onto the set, smile at the new Mary Poppins, Emily Blunt, and pass the torch, Matthew's torch had been extinguished decades ago. However, there was a strange, perhaps unintentional poignancy in how the character of adult Michael Banks was written in the sequel. In the sequel, the adult Michael Banks is a man in crisis, a grieving widower facing financial ruin who has lost his sense of wonder. Ironically, the fictional Michael suffered the fate that the real Matthew Garber avoided. The character became gray and anxious. Matthew never did. He died while he was still seeking, still on the trail. We never had to see him lose his spark. Matthew Garber never became gray. He never sat behind a desk worrying about interest rates. He never compromised his tuppence. He died while he was still in the phase of exploration, still on the hippie trail, still seeking. There is a bitter comfort in this. We never had to see Matthew Garber sell out. We never had to see him do a bad commercial for insurance. We never had to see him lose his spark. He remains in our collective memory, suspended in that state of eternal potential. As we near the end of our journey, we must strip away any romantic notions of destiny. Matthew did not die because of a star's curse. He died because of a biological accident. It was a game of Russian roulette, played with a microscopic virus in a single meal. This randomness is what hurts the most. It reminds us that the line between a Disney legend and a forgotten tragedy is razor thin, decided not by fate, but by chance. It reminds us that all the fame and magic in the world cannot protect you from the fragility of the human body. So how should we remember him? If you go back to Mary Poppins one last time, there is a pivotal scene that serves as the perfect epitaph for Matthew Garber's life. It is the scene at the Fidelity Fiduciary Bank. Mr. Banks takes Michael and Jane to his workplace. The goal is to get Michael to open an account. The old directors of the bank, wizened, greedy, dusty men, surround the little boy. They loom over him. They sing to him. They demand he invest his tuppence, 2 pennies. They promise him that if he gives them his coin, he will be part of railways, plantations, and majestic imperial power. They offer him the world of adulthood, compound interest, status, stability. "Give me the money," the old banker shouts, snatching at the boy's hand. And what does Michael Banks do? What does Matthew Garber do? He screams, "No!" He snatches his hand back. He shouts, "Give me back my money." He causes a panic. The customers hear him screaming. They think the bank is insolvent, and they all rush to withdraw their cash. The bank closes. The empire of finance is brought to its knees by one small boy who refuses to play the game. This is the legacy of Matthew Garber. He refused to give his tuppence to the machine. In real life, the bank was the expectations of society. It was the expectation that a child star should stay in Hollywood. It was the expectation that a young man should go to university, get a job, and settle down. It was the expectation that he should live a safe, curated life. Matthew refused. He kept his coin. He spent it on his own terms, on adventure, on travel, on the search for enlightenment in the East. He paid a terrible price for that freedom. But in that refusal, he preserved his soul. For 40 years, the lie screamed louder than the truth. But today, the fog has lifted. We no longer see the tabloid caricature. We see the truth. We see the boy in the flat cap. We see the boy who learned to laugh on the ceiling. We see Matthew Garber. And as we look back on his short, bright flash of existence, we are left with one final haunting question. In a world that constantly demands we invest our souls in the bank of safety and conformity, isn't the boy who holds on to his tuppence, no matter the cost, the only one who is truly free?